Hi, Sachsenhausen, Kolonia Gwarna, Parna, Germania richtig dicker Heil, Sachsenhausen. Wirtycie jak bambusik, trupie łebki to kaktusy heil, es lebe kule der Kampf.
Welcome to Descendant Stuff, a podcast by and for the descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners, working together to uncover the unanswered questions of its history. Sachsenhausen was a Nazi concentration camp located in Oranienburg, Germany, used from 1936 through April 1945. It was used as a labor camp, with a network of subcamps and worksites around the region, as well as a prison camp, death camp, medical experimentation center, and SS training ground. It was also the administrative center for all Nazi concentration camps. We are Jakob, Kelsey, and Nicole, three descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners. Though our relatives were imprisoned for different reasons, we've discovered we have much in common. In each episode, we interview other descendants, researchers, and even survivors, sharing stories, memories, and research to build a clearer picture of the past, one that goes beyond the records. Through these conversations, we honor those who suffered and died at Sachsenhausen and strengthen our collective understanding of our own ancestors' experiences. In this episode, I will be speaking with one of my Descendant Stuff co-producers, Kelsey Snook. In May of 2025, some members of our project team, including Kelsey, attended the Sachsenhausen Memorial's commemoration event for the 80th anniversary of liberation. While attending the event, Kelsey learned a little-known fact. There was a sizable group of Spanish prisoners at Sachsenhausen, about 270. She discovered this during the speech by the Spanish ambassador to Germany, Ambassador Pascual Navarro, who later gave her a brief interview. We were already aware of many different prisoner groups at Sachsenhausen, but this group, our podcast team was completely unaware of. Wanting to know more, Kelsey dove into research over the summer after the event, and today we want to share with you, our listeners, both clips from the interview and some context. Kelsey, welcome.
Hello.
First of all, thank you so much for initiating this research and for taking the time to share what you've learned about this slice of Sachsenhausen history with me and our listeners.
I'm very excited to talk about this. Thank you for joining me. I was mesmerized by Ambassador Navarro's speech for two reasons. First, I was sitting there at the Klinkerwerks discovering at the moment the existence of Spanish prisoners at Sachsenhausen. And then second, I was impressed with the message of Ambassador Navarro's speech.
What was it about his speech that impressed you so much?
Sitting there, I was thinking, there's this odd club of people who emerged out of Sachsenhausen history because that place was this place for the Nazi government to stuff away any people with traits or views they found undesirable and then do terrible things to those people. And all of those people and descendants of those people are now part of a club. Like, I'm in the club, you're in the club, who all have this common understanding of the mechanics in society and in government that make it possible for a place like Sachsenhausen to exist. And so Ambassador Navarro was describing those things, describing the impact and the mechanics of that. And it was so impactful to hear him talk about also our responsibility from having this knowledge. And then he was just saying, like, the words of his speech were describing it by saying that remembering is an act of justice. It's a moral obligation. It means that it's not just remembering, but it's understanding what happened and what must not be repeated and apply that in everyday life. And then he was also just talking about the role of the memorial for its contribution as a reminder to strengthening our democracy and coexistence and freedom. And so hearing his words, I just wanted him to say more, so I ran up and asked him for a brief interview.
Oh, I'm really glad you did that. Related to Spain and Spanish people, I was visiting Sachsenhausen last month, and I actually noticed there were a lot of Spanish visitors. Jakob told me that according to the Sachsenhausen Memorial team, the current most frequent visitors to the memorial site are from Spain. I wonder if these visitors are aware of the history of Spanish prisoners at Sachsenhausen. What do you think?
I would be surprised. I'd be really curious to speak with them because it's such a little known fact that I would wonder if it's related. But it is very interesting, and I would hope that our research this summer, our conversation in this podcast would help let some of our listeners know about this group and maybe, hopefully, even reach some descendants of Spanish prisoners who would be willing to share their story here with us.
They would be great to host Spanish descendants on future episodes. I'm really grateful Ambassador Navarro gave you some time to talk while you were there for the 80th commemoration. He also made it a point of this being a little-known story, which is one of the things that got us interested in diving into this research that we're going to share about today. Why don't we start with a clip from the interview?
That sounds great.
Bueno, muchas gracias, ¿no? Estamos en Klinkerwerk, que es un campo exterior de Sachsenhausen.
Thank you very much. We're at the Klinkerwerk, an outpost of Sachsenhausen. The Sachsenhausen administration has invited me as the Spanish ambassador to commemorate all the Spaniards who were in Sachsenhausen and who suffered National Socialist persecution there. It's a little-known story because perhaps better known is the story of Franco's regime. He was an ally of Hitler, but there were actually many Spaniards who, after the Second Republic, fought against the Nazis in France. And from there, they were deported to various concentration camps.
Fueron deportados a varios campos de concentración, fueron perseguidos y deportados.
They were persecuted and deported to various concentration camps in Germany, and very importantly, to Sachsenhausen. Among them were such notable figures as Francisco Largo Caballero, who was president of the government of Spain during the Second Republic before Franco's regime. There were many Spaniards who suffered here, who collaborated with other prisoners here, who worked together, supported each other, and many of whom died, but some of them, after the liberation of the camps, were unable to return to Spain.
Pues no pudieron volver a España.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack in just this short clip. So why don't we dive a little bit into the history for our listeners?
Yeah, so to set the stage, as he mentioned, we were at the site of the Klinkerwerk, a satellite outside of the actual Sachsenhausen camp.
Yes. During World War II, it was the world's largest brickmaking factory, right?
Yes.
It was an extremely brutal place to work. Each day, the SS marched up to 2,000 inmates over the canal bridge to the Klinkerwerk brickworks under the gaze of local Oranienburg residents. On the way back, the inmates trundled a cart laden with the bodies of that day's dead. The detail was especially feared among the inmates as a death camp because the SS used the Klinkerwerk labor as a way to deliberately murder prisoners. In fact, when I was there in September for our first meeting, Jakob and I visited the Klinkerwerk as well, and he told me one of the very gruesome ways that people would die, or if they died, they would also sometimes just get pushed right into the canal right there. So I think it's really important to have that background. And this is exactly where the Spanish ambassador was speaking from, right? At the events commemorating the memory of the Klinkerwerk.
Yeah. The Klinkerwerk was feared amongst all the prisoners. You did anything to avoid having to work at the Klinkerwerk because every part of that work process was a way to kill a prisoner deliberately.
Ambassador Navarro mentioned that those who were persecuted and deported to concentration camps had actually fought against the Nazis in France. Can you share a little more about these Spanish citizens, who they were and how they ended up in Sachsenhausen?
Sure. So as the Nazis were coming into power in Germany in 1933, Spain was undergoing a civil war. That had started in 1936 between the existing government, which was the communist Spanish Republican Party, and nationalist rebels. And when, in 1939, the nationalist rebels won, their leader was the fascist dictator Francisco Franco, and he came to power. And Franco and his government, in retribution, brutally repressed the citizens and political opponents with forced labor, their own concentration camps, and executions. And 500,000 Spanish people were then stripped of their nationality and forced by Spain into exile. So they were forced to leave the country and were put into internment camps in southern France. And then there was pressure from the French government to get rid of those they considered undesirable Reds, quote unquote. And so France forced the return of those Spanish people back into Spain. And then I think that was mostly women and children. And then other people, mostly men, were enlisted in the French army. And so on May 10th in 1940, when Germany invaded France, which is this key thing, about 5,000 Spanish Republicans died in the fighting. And then of those who survived, almost 10,000 Spanish Republicans were rounded up and deported from prisoner and prisoner of war camps, with about 7,500 of those ending up in Mauthausen. So this is the path of how these Spanish nationals somehow started getting under Nazi control. And so Mauthausen was where the majority of them were, but then they were also sent to Buchenwald, Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück camps. And then in total, about 60,000 Spanish Republicans were made to perform forced labor under Hitler's Nazi Germany. And then starting in January 1943, most of the Republicans deported to Sachsenhausen arrived from, their arrival date was basically January 1943 from this transit camp called in Gómez, France. And in total, about 270 Spanish nationals were prisoners at Sachsenhausen.
And these 270 prisoners, they were mostly former members of the Spanish Republican Party, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Almost exclusively. All of these Spanish Republicans were opponents to Franco. And so by Franco's allyship with Hitler, they were by default considered opponents of Hitler. And so those Spanish prisoners saw themselves as anti-fascists, and they felt a duty to resist and subvert the Nazis, and that meant that their beliefs aligned with many, luckily, when they arrived at Sachsenhausen, their beliefs aligned with the communist political prisoners who were already at Sachsenhausen. So it was this kinship and camaraderie that was really helpful for their survival once they reached the Sachsenhausen camp.
Ambassador Navarro also mentioned there were some notable figures amongst the Spanish prisoner group at Sachsenhausen.
Yeah, totally. The most notable one was Francisco Largo Caballero, and he was the president of the government of Spain prior to Franco. And so when he was defeated, his government was defeated, he became a part of this group. And although when he was transported, he was very badly beaten coming to Sachsenhausen, he managed to survive the camp due to the help provided by the fellow prisoners who felt this political alignment and camaraderie with this communist background.
Thanks for giving all of that background on who those prisoners were. I wonder, just like we wonder when we speak with descendants, if there's anything that you can share about what daily life might have been like for that group of prisoners at Sachsenhausen.
Yeah, I was really curious to know, every prisoner group kind of had their own bubble because they all had really unique circumstances for how they got there or who they were with or what the work detail was like. So I was really curious about that. There were luckily quite a few survivors of this group who lived to write books about their time at Sachsenhausen, including Francisco Largo Caballero. They were describing how they were humiliated each day with those forced march, to the Klinkerwerk, to their forced labor. They were ordered, for example, one of them described being ordered to take off their caps. So just so that people of Oranienburg who were observing them marching to their labor could spit and throw rocks at the prisoners' heads. And in kind of like a compassionate way, Francisco is describing like in a sympathetic way, he's saying, well, they were doing that because Nazi propaganda made those people believe that the prisoners were criminals. Like, these are all people who weren't convicted of a crime, who were not, in fact, criminals. But the people of Oranienburg believed they were criminals and so felt compelled to participate in there. And then additionally, in their clothing, each prisoner wore their prisoner number, and they also had a red triangle that was typical for political prisoners. And inside the red triangle was the letter S, meaning Spaniard, or the German word for Spanish, in the center. And they worked in the Klinkerwerk factory, but there were about 50 Spanish Republicans who were stationed at the Heinkel factory, and that was a factory that produced a very impressive 3 aircraft per day. So they were part of this manufacturing process, and prisoners experienced not just camp life, but the daily effects of war. So, for example, if you're in this Heinkel factory, the Allied forces were interested in bombing that, and they did. The Allied forces bombed the factory, and so one of the Sachsenhausen prisoners described on April 19th in 1944 that, quote, "We were bombed by British air forces using incredibly powerful incendiary bombs, and we were hiding in the kitchen cellars, and an iron beam saved us, stopping the attack. Otherwise, we would have been buried there forever."
You mentioned earlier that the Spanish prisoners saw themselves as anti-fascists and had a kinship and camaraderie with other groups that were there for political reasons. And in his interview with you, the ambassador actually mentioned support from other groups. Do you know anything about this?
Yeah, so again, with that whole Spanish Civil War, Caballero was the opposition group, the communist group, and so the Spanish and French anti-fascists collaborated closely once they were in the camp. Like those prisoners groups were very allied. Their languages were similar. They could speak freely with each other, and their beliefs were similar, so they could have a kinship with each other. And they collaborated on some of these sabotage efforts and paid with their lives once they were suspected of sabotage. And they described in their memories, in their written memories, that how they, in the process of manufacturing the war material, gave them the opportunity to have sabotage, and which was punishable by death. And their goal was to reduce the capacity, the military capacity of the German production line. And so the Spanish prisoners would deform pieces that were being manufactured, like with poor rivets and things like that, and were trying to waste as much material as possible.
That's really interesting. You know, when I've been on tours in Sachsenhausen, a lot of people, they ask questions about that kind of sabotage. The responses that I've got, or that I've heard, is that although it happened, it wasn't super common because of what you said, because of putting your life at risk. But it does make sense that this particular group would engage in activities like that if they were already anti-fascist and fighting against fascism before they were prisoners. Why wouldn't they while they were imprisoned? Another point that the ambassador mentioned was that Spanish prisoners supported one another. Did you uncover anything interesting about this, or their identity, or how they came together as a group while you were doing your research?
Yeah, so each group kind of has their own way of operating, or ways that they can get around and have their own, express their own identity. And one unique thing that was described was that the Spanish Republicans used the date of April 14th, which was a national holiday in the Spanish Republic, and they celebrated that in secret to unify their group. And this really shocked me because I know from my own family research that my prisoner group would never have been able to pull this off. It was simply too dangerous. But what this group did, former prisoner Jose Carabasa described how over several weeks, this sounds incredible to me, that they stole and hid food. And they stole and stored about, he says, 50 kilos of potatoes and several large loaves of bread. This is just shocking to me that they were able to do this. He said that they were able to store it in an unused building, and then they ate, and he says, of course, in absolute silence. This is in a book called, written by Eduardo Pons and Mariano Constante. It's called The Pigs. And so they collected this quote from Jose Carabassa describing this.
Wow, that's really incredible. Same, I can't imagine how they could have pulled that off.
And then the fear in eating it in silence.
Yeah. Do you know anything, or can you talk more about the fate of these Spanish nationals? How did they leave the camp? Were there survivors?
Yeah, so obviously they're the survivors because we can read their stories, which is incredible that we have that. There were prisoners who died due to the reasons a lot of prisoners died, which was the poor health, the brutal labor conditions, the rampant illness, the insufficient food always, and the brutality of the Nazi SS. However, generally, a group of them survived until the end of the camp.
And what do you know about their liberation?
So at the end, the prisoners who were surviving at Sachsenhausen, on April 16th, 1945, the Soviet army was on the outskirts of Berlin, of the capital of the Reich. And so that there was this sense that they were coming, and so the SS were preparing the camps to be evacuated. And so on April 20th, 1945, 4 days later, as those liberating troops were approaching the camps, the clearing of Sachsenhausen started, and the SS began forcing prisoners on death marches. And these were carried out on foot without water or food, where many marching prisoners died because they were walking 20 to 40 kilometers daily with practically no rest. And they were all headed on foot to the Baltic Sea because there was this great plan to get rid of them at the Baltic Sea. And so these marches intersected with the liberating armies in the Below Forest in Germany, and depending on where the various groups of inmates were between the 2nd or the 4th of May, they were liberated by either the Soviet or the American army. And then there were prisoners who were too weak to walk, and those were left behind at Sachsenhausen. And prisoner Pedro Martin, in his account, said, Jose Carabassa came looking for me to go with them on the marches. This is Jose Carabassa, the dude who talked about the potatoes. And Jose came looking for Pedro Martin and he said, I told him no, that if I left, they would shoot me because I couldn't walk. So on the afternoon of April 22nd, I could still hear the fighting going on around us. And from my bed in the infirmary, I could see the entrance to the gate diagonally across the street. And suddenly, that gate, the Arbeit-Macht-Frei gate, opened. And I saw a Russian appear, mounted on a Siberian horse, machine gun in hand. That's it. Our liberators have arrived. We won the battle of our lives, is what he said. And Pedro Martin wrote this in a book called It Was the Night, which is just incredible to imagine that scene.
Thanks so much for doing all this research and piecing this story together. It really is a lot of information. So there is this sizable group of Spanish prisoners, most of them deported from France, not Spain. Many of them actually survived. What happened next for this group?
This was the weird, incredibly frustrating thing about this group is, okay, the war ended, and then that was totally ambiguous for all of these Spanish prisoners because not all nationalities were able to just go back to home and resume their lives. And this was a group of prisoners who were not able to go back home and continue their lives. They couldn't return to their country. Franco was still in power. And there was some pressure that the French deportees convinced, like the former French prisoners convinced their government to take Spanish prisoners back into France because those Spanish prisoners could not go back to Spain. And eventually, France recognized these Spanish prisoners as heroes. So all of these former Spanish prisoners were forced to either rebuild their lives in exile, or they could somehow return to Spain, but they had to remain silent and stay under the radar.
Do you know what happened to Francisco Largo Caballero?
He spent most of World War II imprisoned in Sachsenhausen until the liberation, so he did survive. However, he died in exile in Paris in 1946, which is really not that long after the war, and his remains were returned to Madrid in 1978 because Franco died in 1975, so he was finally allowed to return in death.
So like most Spanish prisoners who were liberated, he lived in exile.
Mm-hmm.
As we spoke about earlier, all of this is such a little known part of history. A quote struck me from some of the materials that you shared with me. According to the Mauthausen historian, Josep Calvet, until a few years ago, the story of the Spanish deportees had been completely forgotten. Why? Because the great majority of these people didn't come back to Spain. They settled in France and never came back. By the time Franco had died and democracy restored, a lot of them were already dead. That meant the memory of all this remained distant.
Yeah, like us, until very recently, very few people know that Spanish nationals were part of this prisoner population. There are still unanswered questions. For example, there are not clear records of everyone who was exiled and where they ended up. Because the Spanish prisoners came from France, they were not recorded as being Spanish. They were recorded as being French. And even then, many of the records of Sachsenhausen were burned towards the end of the camp, and so there's a lot of records that just don't exist. As Ambassador Navarro mentioned,
well, we need to recover some in Spain, as we still don't know where they are. Some because we don't know where they were buried, or where they were exiled, or where they are in Europe or America. And it's about remembering their lives. Let them be an example for everyone and offer them dignity through, as I said before, offering nationality to their descendants, which is what we're working on now.
So Spain is actually offering nationality to descendants of this prisoner group?
Yes. There is now a Spanish law offering citizenship to descendants of families who were exiled, who were never able to return. This is called the Democratic Memory Law. It began in October 2022. It considers all Spaniards who left the country between July 18th, 1936 and December 31st, 1955 to be exiles. So that date, it predates World War II and continues 10 years past the end of World War II. All of those people who left Spain are considered eligible. Those people, their descendants, are eligible to seek Spanish citizenship again. And it's a great, I'm very excited about this law because it allows generational gaps. The grandchildren of Spaniards exiled between 1936 and 1975 can initiate the process regardless of whether their parents have done so before.
And you shared with me from your research that due to the records not being clear, some descendants don't actually even know that they're descendants of Sachsenhausen or other concentration camps.
Yeah, that's correct. During the course of his research in Catalonia last year, Mauthausen historian Josep Calvet was surprised to discover that some families still had no idea that their uncles or grandfathers had been in Mauthausen. And he said this needs to be told. We need to get this story out there so that we can look at the mistakes of the past and make sure they don't happen again, and that memories that don't help us look at the past and stop ourselves repeating it are not memories.
Es un trabajo no solo de recordar, sino también para aprender que no vuelva.
And it is a job not only to remember, but also to learn to ensure that these events never happen again, that a similar war never happens again in Europe. It is a reminder for them, for those of us here, and for those of us in Spain who have been pursuing a policy of historical memory, particularly the current government, with even greater intensity. We must remember the events. We must remember those who have suffered as a result of these events, those who have been persecuted, and above all, we must restore the dignity of those who suffered and of their descendants.
And as with many prisoner populations, I suspect part of him getting that story out there is not just so that history can't be repeated, it's so that families who don't know their history or maybe have questions, unanswered questions, and still don't know their story at all, or don't know the full story because their families have lived in fear and kept it secret. It can take generations to figure this out.
I can actually relate to that in a lot of ways because I didn't know until just a few years ago that my own great-grandfather, Max During, had been imprisoned at Sachsenhausen.
Yeah, same. I did not know that my family existed and was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen either. So this feels very relatable.
It does. Well, thanks for doing all this research, Kelsey. I know I keep thanking you, but it's a lot of work, and I'm so excited and happy to be on this journey with you, learning, about the history, this common history that we share. It takes a lot of time and energy to figure these stories out. We really have been uncovering a lot about different prisoner groups at Sachsenhausen. And as descendants, it's been helping us to fill in some of the unanswered questions and gaps in our own histories. Even when our ancestors are from different prisoner groups, they were all victims and they should all be remembered.
Yeah, sharing individual stories of the prisoner groups helps us piece together a picture of the larger one. And it's just something that if we all look individually, we don't get the whole picture. So we can't do it alone.
Maybe by doing this research and having this conversation, we will be able to reach some descendants of this particular prisoner group, descendants of Spanish Republican prisoners.
Yes. If any descendants of a Spanish Sachsenhausen prisoner is listening, we would love to speak with you and record your story to be part of our community. You can reach out to us through the contact link in our show description. We would love to share your voice and stories.
Thanks again, Kelsey, for speaking with me today. And for our listeners who'd like to know more, please check out our show description for the full transcripts of both Ambassador Pascual Navarro's interview with Kelsey and his 80th commemoration event speech, as well as a full list of useful resources we came across during our research on this topic. Descendant Stuff Podcast is produced by Jakob Feistauer, Kelsey Snook, and Nicole Wines, 3 descendants of Sachsenhausen prisoners and co-creators of the Sachsenhausen Stuff Project. The Descendant Stuff team would like to extend a special thank you to the team at Sachsenhausen Memorial and Museum, especially Dr. Astrid Lai and the members of the Educational Department's project, What Voice Do We Have?, as well as the Descendants Collective Voices of the Next Generation. The theme song, Heil Sachsenhausen, was written by Alexander Kulisiewicz while he was imprisoned at Sachsenhausen and performed by him after the war. It is used with permission from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Kulisiewicz collection. If you are a Sachsenhausen descendant who would like to share your story, please contact us through our website at www.sachsenhausen-stuff.com or use the Contact Us link in the show notes below.
Heil Sachsenhausen. A jak będę jutro wzdychał lewą nóżką, ci zawtikam. Heil, es lebe Kulturkampf.